I gotta have my cat PDF. And what we find is
right, the idea was to talk through some of the most commonly asked questions that we get from clients.
Sure. And like I said last time, if you're like, ooh, I like that, but that sucked how you said it, just ask us to say it again.
We're going to be here all day then.
Fair.
All right, let me try and find a good one to start with. These are all lame. That's kind of lame.
You're lame.
Okay, this is a good one. This is what we hear a lot. How fast can we deploy and see value in AI with our projects?
Deploy AI is a little bit of a loaded question. Being able to use like a commercially supported AI model really quickly. I mean, within a day, you can be talking to that. Deploy AI might also mean running it on-prem. It may also mean, using the AI-assisted AI tools. It may mean actually using it within your application. So depending on which one of those you're asking about, very different answers.
Well, that also assumes custom software development angle, right?
Yeah, I would assume so. Ryan mentioned custom or not custom. You mentioned commercial AI.
Is that public or private?
Oh my God, stop. We're going to go off on tangent. Nobody knows the difference between public and commercial AI. It's like the same thing. Nobody calls it commercial AI except you nerds. I've never even heard commercial AI.
Commercially hosted, yeah. Yeah, because really what you're talking about is the difference between who's hosting it, right? Are you hosting it yourself, using an open source model and hosting it? Which you can obviously stick into your cloud infrastructure as well. Or are you talking about using a vendor's model that's running out there and you're using their infrastructure?
So can an open source model be a private model?
Yes.
What do you mean by private model, Julie?
It can be hosted in AWS and Azure. I mean, you have access to all the open source ones.
You can use a model, right? That's an open source model, and then take that model and put it on your own
cloud infrastructure. Yes.
Would be the private model, even though you're using an open source.
Private, it's just like whenever you say that, I'm like, what does it mean?
That's what I'm saying. Where? Then what's the verbiage?
When you say private, I think you mean not available outside of your organization.
Not in the public cloud.
Yes, maybe secure is the better word than private, because that's the problem that we get into when people are searching for, when you see online, they'll search for a model. They'll say, well, I want to make sure that nobody can get into it, that my business is kept private and secure. So we'll search for a private model. So that's kind of the language behind it.
Right. But honestly, a lot of times there's, a misunderstanding too, right? A lot of times when people are searching for the private, LLM, what they're really worried about is, are they going to be able to see the prompts that I'm sending, the questions that I'm asking, and the data that's being returned? And are they going to train off of that? A lot of times when people are going to private, models or private, most of the time, that's what I'm finding is they're thinking that, I really need that because I'm worried about, the questions that my employees are sending out, and the answers that are coming back and the types of data that they're sending up. Maybe there's PHI in there. Maybe there's, some kind of IP that's going up in there. That's usually, I think, when people are searching for private, what they're worried about.
It's not an issue, really.
Right. We've had a number of these conversations with clients or prospects to kind of educate on, like, well, the enterprise, the commercially available models, right, that enterprise using, from a contractual sense, they're not training on your data.
Yeah, they're in legal jail. They can't, when they sign that paper. I mean, if it leaks out that they are, I mean, obviously you could sue them into oblivion. And so it really comes down to, do you trust the legal system, and can you, do you have the money to sue them, right? For example, some of our clients, they have their own developers, they do their own software development, and like one of our clients didn't trust, using GitHub Copilot. And, Microsoft addresses that now, where you get your own, kind of endpoint that you configure your Copilot for. And so all your developers have to have a specific URL that hits a enterprise kind of level endpoint that's audited, observed, and you know exactly what's going through there. And, you know, so from that standpoint, they also say, this is yours. No other company is going through the same endpoint. So that helps them feel better.
Yeah. So do you think it probably the hysteria of, oh, we want to make sure everything's secure is kind of stemmed from, you know, hearing once upon a time somebody leaked something that was proprietary or something, and now it's like you just can't let go of it?
It reminds me a lot of when cloud became a thing. It was like that getting companies to embrace the cloud, like, well, all my data is in the cloud, and you know, so it takes a while for the companies to get comfortable with it. You know, the bigger concern that I would have is OpenAI. There's an article that was just out today where, you know, the courts basically told them that they have to, you know, save all of the chats, all of the inference data that goes through there, because a company's suing them for copyright law. And they're like, we're not going to do that, because that, you know, they agree not to do that. You know, so that's a bigger concern to me, is not necessarily that, you know, something like a company like OpenAI would sign a contract and then break it. It'll be more like an external entity, like a government law or something, that causes them all of a sudden to have to do that. And you've already kind of pushed your chips all in as a company on OpenAI. Now you've got to like quickly switch to a different provider on premises.
On the private side, or the on-premises hosted side,
The other interesting thing about that, or where it makes more, you know, like we were saying, less sense maybe about the worry about, hey, you know, that data is going up there and they're training on it. But it does make sense in
a cost sometimes scenario where it's like, we're going to be
sending an absurd amount of data, you know, to these models, right? There is a sort of an inflection point sometimes where it's like, well, you know, we really want to be able to control that cost and understand it. And so sometimes companies will go after that approach of like, we've got either already have the hardware on premises, or we're going to share it. Or, you know, we've had some prospects that talked about like, they've got the hardware that's shared amongst different organizations already. And so, you know, you can really, rather than most commercially available models, right, it's token based, right? It's about how much data you send up. That's how much you get charged for, right? Well, with a on-premises, you know, hosted model, you don't have that, right? You just have that you're paying for the hardware. And obviously you've got to maintain it yourself, but it's a fixed cost, and that's the hardware and running it, and you know, what you know, pay for just maintenance of that hardware. So
Do a lot of our clients or people come in and ask,
I don't know why I just did that.
I appreciate that thumbs up though. Yeah.
Agreed.
that's a good question. Do clients actually come in and ask about the token costs, and if there's certain,
Yes.
you know, LLMs that they can use that would be better for them? And how do we steer them? Do we steer them in maybe where they already have everything in the cloud and their infrastructure, or do we take them off to the best solution that would be the cheapest? Or how do we usually, you know, guide them?
To me, it really depends on the problem we're trying to solve, right? So if it's, you know, like we've done workflow applications where we compress the time it takes, you know, to do a specific business workflow in healthcare specifically. And what we find is it's usually the kind of task that's happening. It's summarization of a lot of data. And what we find is I think we use like O1 Mini, OpenAI model. And that one's super cheap when it comes to inference and tokens. So it really doesn't matter. But yeah, it depends on the task. It depends on the amount of data that you're, you know, like for instance, we're doing summarization, and what we found is the O1 Mini models did really, really well, and they were super cheap. So from that aspect, cost isn't a problem. Like I think we did the cost estimation. It was like $2,000 a year. It was like super cheap. But, you know, we have some other healthcare clients where the amount of data that's required to do the inference was so much, and the level of the model that we required, the cost was so much that was like $60 an hour. So it was expensive.
I'd also add one specific thing that you asked, like, or where are we usually steering? I would say all the things that Byron said are dead on. And then in our experience so far with the different prospects and clients, usually we're not steering them toward on-prem. It's generally shakes out to where we're putting them in some kind of commercially hosted, because like Byron said, most of the time it is so cheap, and most of the time it's faster. You're not having to maintain that hardware. It's specialized cases. Now, back to your question though, on the the costing and everything else. So right out of the gate, we get that pretty quickly, and it's like, well, there's a function of which model. There's a function of how much, data that you're going to send up to it. And, like Byron was saying, it's like early on, there's a lot of discovery that goes on with which model is good enough for your needs, and then which answer is good enough. Because depending on that, those different models have different costs for their token inputs and outputs. And so there is a little bit of time that's spent up front before we can get to an answer for sure.
Talk a little more about cost. Reasoning models, for example, they can be tougher to track costs, because when they go into the reasoning step, they're actually using tokens, right? And it's harder to sort of estimate that, whereas if you're just doing a normal model that doesn't have thinking or reasoning built in, it's easy to kind of calculate the estimate, because it's how many tokens are going in.
How many of our clients are in the cloud versus on-prem? And when they come to us, are they like super busted or just like all the halfway busted?
The majority of our clients are all in the cloud. And then a lot of those, they have both. They're on-prem and in the cloud.
How do I choose the right AI model? That's kind of like what we just talked about, really, right?
Yeah, that one to me is a tougher one.
It is.
How so?
One of our clients, we had to do some stuff where we had to take a bunch of data, and the system prompt had tons of instruction. And what we found is all of the models did pretty good. We tried pretty much every OpenAI model. We used, Anthropic, Claude. But where sometimes you have to do a big POC, a big kind of testing phase and iterate and have a defined set of test data that you use to identify which model is the best.
How long does something like that take? So they'll come to us and we'll say, we need like a week or two to kind of do a POC, get all your data together and find the best solution? Or do you kind of have some in your pocket that you have an idea of what you want to start with?
Yeah, I mean, it takes, I don't know, like we usually do things as we try to be agile in our approach. So we set up sort of a cadence, not necessarily sprints, because we're not actually doing a lot of development, but more of a once a week, we'll work with the client, and they will, maybe the first meeting that we have, we try to understand their problem. And then the next meeting we have, we say, well, we're going to, what's the end result? What is the final output that you want to achieve? And we look at that, and then we sort of back into like, where are all the data parts of that? Where does that come from? And that helps us to identify kind of the, okay, here's the data we need to get you this final result, this output. And then we say, okay, let's start with like 100 examples, and they get us that in, various formats. We've gotten formats from like CSV files to JSON to XML.
How often are these models changing too?
A lot.
Yeah.
You guys keep track of all the new stuff that is coming out.
I mean, I get newsletters every day.
Yeah, me too.
About, what new feature and what model has been released, because not only do you have one company putting out multiple models a year, multiply that by the number of vendors out there that are putting out models that people use, and it's a lot.
For me, it's newsletters, podcasts, and I follow all the companies on Twitter, so I know instantly they release something.
What's the difference, or what's the example for us non-tech folk between a reasoning model and just a regular model?
The simplest one is one I've already mentioned, which is summarization. Like, you don't really need a reasoning model for summarization of content, right? But if you're doing something like taking a bunch of data elements and you need the model to transform that stuff, and it has a lot of instructions, a lot of like format templates, like inside the system prompt, you're having it shape the output. I find that reasoning and thinking models do a better job of that, especially if, there's a little bit of logic in order to do the transformation.
The other thing too is on the reasoning models, that's not a new advancement, but I'll say relatively new, that, its ability to show sort of its thought process too. In the past, that's been one of the big factors when you look at like traditional ML, over like using deep learning LLMs. Well, with traditional ML, it's really easy to describe how it arrived, at its solution, right? And so a lot of people have been, I can't follow the thought process, and how did you arrive at the answer? And I want to be able to know that. Newer models actually allow you to see that processing, and that thought process is sort of an audit, which is really big, and it kind of takes away that advantage.
And where does agentic AI fit in this? Is that reasoning, or is that reasoning plus plus?
Reasoning plus plus. Reasoning plus tools, maybe?
Yeah, right. Does it fall under a reasoning model, or is it something completely different?
An agent doesn't have to be a reasoning model. No, an agent can technically be many models, right? An agent is all about the chain of thought orchestration. Does it have short-term and long-term memory? Things like that. Like the specific model is not as important, I guess. Like I said, you can have an agent could be a composite of different models. And then, like Ryan's saying, also it can interact with its environment via tools and functions and plugins, or whatever you want to call them.
When you talk about the excitement around the agents, all the stuff Byron said is true, but a lot of times what people are coming to us and they're thinking about is the ability for the agent to interact in some way with the environment. And it just kind of opens up the world there in terms of what it can do.
Because it's more than just kind of like a chatbot.
Correct. An agent can have a conversation component to it, but it doesn't necessarily have to interact with a human at all.
It's perception, right? It can interact with the environment to bring data into the conversation, or if it's running on its own without conversation, just be able to sense its world, understand things, call APIs, monitor and temperature gauges, whatever type of thing.
Like we've done POCs internally where we have an agent that actually gets its own desktop, and it can launch, a browser and search websites and collect data and images. And even like, for example, a test that I did was, go out, get some data off a website, then convert that into a PDF. And it didn't have the software it needed, but it had the ability to interact with the desktop to where it could go get it and download it and install it. And it I was kind of like, wow, that's incredible.
Was that with all the cats?
Yeah, the cat one. That's right. I got to have my cat PDFs, man. Come on.
I mean, you need those cat PDFs. I was actually just going to ask if we had done any agent work, but you still need to give it a prompt, right? I mean, you still need to be able to tell the agent what to do. Can it work autonomously?
It's more, you give it a task, or you can give it a plan, right? So you basically give it a plan of the things that you require. And then inside of that, that system prompt that you hand to it, or you can think of it as its trigger, like here's its inputs, its parameters that it needs, its instructions that it needs to go off and do whatever task that we're asking it to do. The interesting part to me of all of this with agents is workflow is such a big component of it. So when I think of autonomous agents, you've got to have a really good workflow engine, or it's not going to work well.
The other thing too is I forget if it was you that sent me this article. Wasn't it you, Byron, that sent me the article about the simpler agents?
Yes, it was me.
Okay.
No, yeah. It was there's a discussion about
like, do you need these giant workflow agents, to get good ROI type of stuff? Not necessarily, right?
Right. The article is basically saying the majority of businesses, they don't need big, giant agentic workflows. They just need simple agentic automation. I would argue that, our one customer in healthcare where we've compressed a workflow that they have, a business workflow. We didn't actually use a workflow engine at all. We just automated certain steps through the workflow, not the whole thing.
Right. Yeah, small targeted tasks can add up to huge savings, when using agents.
Yeah. So you would find that people come in and think that they need a complete overhaul and like change this and change that. And you're like, well, we can kind of just tweak a couple things.
Right. It's really about like where in your overall scheme, your overall workflow, there's a small piece that's, very high touch, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources. If you can just agentify that part, that's a huge ROI right there.
It reminds me again a lot of what we went through in the cloud world. We would have clients come to us and they would think they would need this giant, infrastructure as code layout with VNets and just super cracked out, design. And, do we need to run Kubernetes and all this kind of stuff? And it's like at the end of the day, to get the return on investment they wanted, it's really simplistic and much easier